This is Streets and People, conversations about people and projects shaping how we move. Find us at getaroundcaboolture.au. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here in the studio with Bryan Tony of the Dallas Housing Coalition. I know Bryan because I was on a Parking Reform Network webinar, as I often am, at 5 a.m, and was really interested in the great changes happening in Dallas. I grew up with Dallas, the television series, big hair, big cars, big oil. I've seen that Houston, Dallas are making these big changes at the moment towards more active and public transport, which is really interesting to have that history. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. Bryan, whereabouts are you calling from?
I'm calling in from Dallas, Texas, which is in the North Texas region. We're a part of the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. We're the fourth largest metropolitan area in all of the U.S. It goes in order: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago area, and then North Texas. But we'll soon be passing Chicago with over 8 million people across our region.
Okay, so it sounds like you're in a similar situation to us, because we now have a larger population in Moreton Bay than Tasmania, and we're just about to surpass our capital, the ACT. It's a very high growth area. We're very car dependent, terrible infrastructure for active and public transport. So I'm very curious to hear how the Housing Alliance got involved with parking reform. What made you interested in this whole area, and why does it still matter to you?
Starting out on a personal level, I grew up in a suburb in between Dallas and Fort Worth. Dallas itself is the 9th largest city in the country. Fort Worth is moving up. It now is more populous than San Francisco, but when people think of Dallas and Fort Worth, they often think of, like you said in your intro, the cowboy Western culture. I grew up in between those two cities, and I'm a product of a two-parent, stable, middle-class household where we didn't move my entire childhood. And through high school, I eventually matriculated to a university in Fort Worth called Texas Christian University and studied political science and economics, because I thought there is so much opportunity for impact and to learn from our history. There's a lot going on in the world politically, and if I can do something to make it a better place, that was something I think my parents instilled in me. And then right after I graduated from university, I moved to Dallas to begin working at our Chamber of Commerce, our business association, which was really focused on economic development. I was working in the education and workforce department, so we wanted to make sure students who were graduating from what we call pre-kindergarten all the way up through higher education were graduating ready for life, ready for a career, or ready to go to work. And not all students go to four-year universities here. We have a lot of great trade schools and opportunities, but so much of your academic success is dictated or guided by what happens at home in your home life. And so working in education policy for a couple of years, I had the opportunity to go work for a commercial real estate association called the Real Estate Council, and got to see what else affected students and families, like the quality of their neighborhoods, how their parents and themselves got to and from work or school. And it totally changed my perspective, just seeing how cities develop from a real estate point of view. And I didn't know a ton about it, but I've really fallen in love with it. And I think housing, not just the educational academic outcomes, but from a health perspective, from an environmental perspective, there's a lot that housing can accomplish. And so we started bringing together the Dallas Housing Coalition in summer of 2022. And then we launched officially in June of 2023. We've grown from 65 members at our first launch to now over 450 members. And they span a wide spectrum of for-profits, nonprofits, not just development groups, but also faith-based neighborhood groups, arts communities. Anybody who's serving people being affected by housing affordability right now are members of ours.
I know you because the webinar that you were on, part of a panel about parking reform. A, what is parking reform? And B, what's that got to do with housing? So perhaps if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Going back, thinking about Texas being a car-centric big city as well, Dallas developed post-industrial revolution, post-introduction of the car. So at one point there was a streetcar system, in Dallas, and those streetcars were torn out and replaced with wider roads and accommodating and repositioning our city around the car. So it, I think, changed how Dallas developed. And the two biggest costs for people and households in our communities is housing and transportation. And having taken away some of the public transit to replace it with cars, we spread out our people and where they live. And our zoning codes have also said you can only build one type of house here, you can only build one type of office or barbershop or some type of community amenity like retail somewhere else. And so our region has continued to sprawl, and that has also increased both, I think, the housing and transportation costs, because people, by having to own a car, you're spending more time and money on gas and car ownership and maintenance, and if they can afford a car at all. And then secondly, from a housing perspective, our developers, the people who build housing, have to, till our quote unquote reform, were required to provide a certain number of parking spaces for people's vehicles. And that's what we pointed out alongside the City of Dallas staff and elected officials, the ones that we partnered with and you got to meet on our parking reform webinar. Chad West and Andrea Udrea from the City of Dallas staff realized that our parking requirements, our zoning codes, were written in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since then. And a lot of them were done without kind of any rhyme or reason. Donald Shoup, anybody who has read The Cost of Free Parking, there is a externality that is associated with providing parking. We're fortunate that other cities in Texas, like Austin, had gone through this process of reforming or entirely removing their parking requirements. We didn't go quite that far in the City of Dallas, but this was a 6-year-long process that began at a city plan commission level and a lot of studying the issue, and eventually passed the full city council by a 14-1 vote in May of 2025. So we're just almost to a year anniversary of our parking reform.
That's very interesting. You've managed to get a whole lot of people in to be part of this. So one of the things that I've started to really look at is how many people are affected by housing and parking and transport and this whole car dependent issue. And we now know this with the fuel crisis, that people are having to spend a lot of money on fuel, and it's having a real impact on whether they can eat, whether they can heat or cool, and whether they can pay the rent. And a lot of people say, well, I'd rather live in my car than live in my house because at least I can travel. And that works for a while, but it doesn't last long. So what sort of different groups have you brought along with you on this journey, and how did you bring them along? Particularly, say, developers who maybe want to get away with as little as possible, and disparate groups like faith-based groups who want the community to do well. There's quite a broad spectrum. How did you bring everybody along for the ride?
I think finding consensus, especially amongst a diverse membership like the Dallas Housing Coalition, starts with our common goal, which is to decrease housing costs across our region. And if we know what our North Star is, that we want to make housing more attainable for people of all incomes, all backgrounds, all stages of life, then we need to be looking at every solution. There are lots of resources that the Parking Reform Network provides in terms of the cost of providing a parking space alone is around $50,000. This usually adds about $100 to $200 in rent that the developer is passing on to their tenants to pay back those parking and construction costs. And I think that was pretty compelling. We realized that there are more parking spaces than we needed across our city. We could see vacant lots. We could see the top of parking garages that weren't being used. And instead of those costs to the developer being passed on to the user, the tenant or home buyer, those parking spaces could be living spaces, and trying to make sure that people understood that there is a benefit here to the community, and it's not just a type of giveaway to the developer for more flexibility. We wanted to make that, I think, emotional case, that business case, that it's more economical And without the amount of time, even from a city staff perspective, to calculate how much parking spaces our development community needed to provide, would lead to more housing being built faster. And that's a win-win for everybody, especially those who are low income and need housing now more than ever.
I was thinking about our council, and they did actually remove parking minimums, or maybe they reduced them down to 1 car space per household. And then there was all this spillover effect, and all the cars were parked on the street because you might have 3 people living in that house. It's no longer the suburban home where you've got the nuclear family like you had growing up. So they doubled the minimum parking requirement to 2. I think it's because there's been not very clear strategy about how to do it. It's been, oh, well, we can remove that, and so therefore we'll do this. I've spoken with one of the bus route planners, and he said in Caboolture, Morayfield, which is where we are, one of the big problems is these new estates, they have a road that goes in and then it's the same road going out. And a bus simply cannot do that because it can't go in one way and then out the next and make meaningful progress. For the bus company, it's just not viable to create that. So then you end up with this car dependency. There's no bus service, so therefore I need a car. And then you've got this housing crisis, so all the garages are actually converted into housing or porches. So I see that there's this massive inconsistency. Have you come across that? And if so, how did you address this conundrum of lack of bus service, poor planning design from developers in new greenfield estates? So a greenfield estate, by the way, for our listener, is where you get a bit of bushland, you clear it, and then you plonk all the housing in, and it's all about yield by the developer. In those kinds of estates, how have you worked with that, and what have you changed in the planning codes? Maybe this is more a question for council, but if you have any insights, what did you glean?
I think from the cycle you're explaining, you need ridership to have good bus service, and you need people living around your bus routes and around your light rail stations. That we at least have the longest light rail system in the entire United States, because we've built out pretty regionally our light rail system. So one of the things that we did was actually eliminate the parking requirements within a half mile around the train stations for light rail, because that's what we call our transit-oriented development. That's where we want to have more people who can live within walking distance of a light rail station. Ideally, we would have also done this around our bus routes, but there were some compromises that had to be made during the ordinance writing and resolutions and the different layers that we went to before our city council finally approved it almost unanimously. But if you do, I think, as a city or as a region where you are, want to increase safety, reduce car reliance over time, arguably save those costs I mentioned before on construction and permitting and time, make your city more resilient and be more accessible to people who don't own cars, like the parking reform movement, if you will, should be something that I think needs to be educated or reminding, and maybe going back and looking at this policy again in a year or two, like, did doubling our parking solve our traffic issue? If not, I'm guessing it won't, but you do need to figure out some type of new solution for your buses, whether it's a designated bus lane for rapid transit or new routes that would give people more options. And it's the spillover parking you mentioned at the beginning of your question. That's something that people were concerned about in Dallas too, like where would people park? And by removing the requirements, we wanted to first say, if nothing's going to change overnight, your parking spaces aren't going to suddenly be gone, and the greenfield development that you mentioned can still be built with as much parking as the private market or that developer wants to build. They just don't have to mandate it and be required to build 2 spaces per unit or house or home in that development, when they know from their own market research that they only need to provide maybe 1 space per unit or household, or 1.5. Like, those kinds of ratios are different for every community, but nobody wants to build something that doesn't get used. So it's in their best interest to continue to provide parking, even if it's not required.
So I'm really curious, who else did you bring along? So you said faith-based, so it's churches. And then who else did you bring into your conversation? How many different types of groups?
We were actually doing a cataloging exercise at the Dallas Housing Coalition just this week. So we have nonprofits and social services. We also have those who are providing our community organizations, education universities. We have businesses and consultants, like even architecture, planning, and design firms. We have a few of our local cities who are members, but they're just sharing best practices. We also have foundations and philanthropy, a lot of banks involved, other advocacy and policy organizations, like chambers of commerce, and then other real estate groups and developers. And some of those real estate and developer groups are also nonprofits themselves, what we call community development corporations, where they have boards of community members and they access some state, local, and federal funding that other for-profit developers don't have access to. So we're trying to reinvest all the benefits into our community. And I think having a big tent, having a really diverse coalition with constituents and stakeholders from all across the city, speaking to their city council member who represents them, is one of the most powerful ways that we were able to affect this change.
And you mentioned banks in there. So we have 4 main banks, and then we have a range of other mutual organizations and building societies and other online banking organizations. What is in their interest with this? Why would they be bothered to spend their money and resources on this project?
Our banks are some of our biggest supporters here. They, I think, benefit when more individuals have more money in their pockets that they can spend and pay back their credit cards with and pay back their debts and mortgages and things like that. There's a lot that they want to do to help people on an individual level with their own accounts. I think they also do a lot of business lending. So on the commercial side, somebody who wants to open their own business, now they don't have to say that I couldn't afford the parking. I couldn't afford to buy enough land to build the parking lot to service my business. Now that's been removed, at least for our bank and lending purposes and small business owners. That was a huge barrier that prevented many from opening or expanding their businesses in new locations and things like that. And then they also have a certain requirement to reinvest in our communities, what's called our Community Reinvestment Act, where our largest banks are required to reinvest into the community, and they report back to the federal government on what those are. So there's both regulatory, there's commercial business lending, and then I think on an individual level, why they're great supporters. And I love working with all of our financial institutions.
That's very interesting. I'm going to have a private conversation with you because I've realized that when it comes to active and public transport, walking, riding, and trying to get more bus services, actually there's a whole lot of people who want to do something different, but we're stuck in this thing, and I'm trying to bring in other groups that I just would never have thought of. And you've just said banking, which is one I'm sitting there going, that surprised me. Developers, obviously, because they want to sell a product that is more walkable. So I was very curious to find out that banks. So any other random ones I had thought about, maybe pet, not-for-profits, because people could take their pets for walks and things like that. And they unfortunately get killed crossing the road and those sorts of things. So I was wondering about pets. Had you gone down that avenue at all? Had you come across that?
I think we've had a couple asks of some of our shelters here to come speak, and there are many residents of Dallas who own pets, and they're looking for housing for themselves and their pets. But yeah, it hasn't been as much, but there is a big pet owning population here in Dallas. You'll see dogs and cats with their owners often.
We're up to the time in the show where I ask, so if somebody is, say, a mum at home with a couple of kids, this is a friend of mine, she's got one who's in year 1 now, and another one who's still at home, spends a bit of time in daycare for her sanity, and then her partner has some health issues, but he works a little bit here and there. She doesn't have time, money, not a lot of energy, What do you recommend that she might be able to do?
Yeah, I think listening to this podcast, number one, continuing to support you, Wendy, and the great work you're doing. I think second, finding out like when the important meetings are happening at your city or in your municipality are hugely important. What we try and do is keep our social media channels active at Dallas Housing Coalition. We have a subscriber and newsletter list, so we're always letting people know like here are the important meetings that relate to housing that are coming up. First, educating yourself on these issues, getting engaged and finding out who your elected officials are certainly is important. If you can get to know them on a personal basis or volunteer or donate to their campaigns, that's a good way to build those relationships, and perhaps you can later serve on a board or commission in your community if there's an issue you're passionate about, like animals. We have a Dallas Animal Services Commission. We have our Planning Commission. We have our Parks and Recreation Board. Those are great ways to also give back and get experience. And then finding out and practicing that kind of empowerment, practicing storytelling and giving public comment and sending an email or calling your elected official when you want them to take a certain action on a personal level. Like, I think those are the three biggest things I recommend is education, engagement, and empowerment.
Okay, and this one is a little bit more difficult because our biggest supporter is a guy with chronic disability and in insecure housing. Sometimes he lives in the neighbourhood, sometimes he's in a completely different neighbourhood. So building up a sense of connection is very difficult for him. He might be in this region, but he might be in Brisbane. He might be somewhere else. So people chop and change in their environments these days. They don't have social connections because of social media. So tell me, what do you suggest somebody in that situation with no money might be able to do?
I think still being able to do those three things I mentioned is not something that necessarily takes any monetary sacrifice, but I do feel like even something as simple as removing parking requirements or reducing them can help bring us closer together. Not only are you going to be campaigning and advocating alongside folks who have the same beliefs, values, and position as you do, that's a huge part of building that social connection that we're missing. But I think also going back to the very beginning of this talk, explaining and understanding like why our cities are so spread out often does come down to these zoning codes, which some of them are old and should be rewritten if they're not working. That's an example of why we need to fix them. There's ways I'm sure we can better serve, like you said, many of the mothers in our communities, but also people who need more access than they're currently being provided and deserve that to move around their city. So it's all hugely important. We want our seniors to be able to age in place and age gracefully. We want people who are working two jobs to find a way to afford housing where they don't have to work a second job anymore. And so just keeping that kind of North Star again in mind of what you're working towards when the going does get tough, as we say here, will be hugely helpful.
And the last person I always ask about is someone who's junior in council. So there's an idea that people in council should get stuff done, and that's very true. And a lot of people go into council because they're really passionate about creating change and they're in these junior positions. And then they get to these walls. They want to implement this stuff and then they get a wall and then they get a wall. And it's actually really difficult internally as much as externally. So say someone's junior in the planning team who maybe is interested in housing or parking policy or whatever. What's something they could do, do you think?
I think reading up on these issues in the US, like we have another group called the Sightline Institute. We already talked about Parking Reform Network. The American Planning Association has a lot of resources. I'm sure there's a similar organization in Australia. Strong Towns has put out a lot of great resources on how we can make our towns more house ready, and any other news articles or academic studies like Dr. Donald Shoup's are all super beneficial. So you have to arm yourself with a variety of data points, a lot of research, so you know who your audience is and you can be more persuasive with your voters or with your leadership and prepared for any kind of the pushback that you might receive internally about, we are a car-oriented city, so why and how are we going to adapt? Well, we're just saying we don't need the one-size-fits-all approach anymore, that we can use our land more efficiently. What about the spillover parking? Have we thought about QR codes and parking meters and better enforcing the parking that we do have, and instead using that money to reinvest in our communities on better sidewalks and bike paths and things like that that make car ownership less necessary? So I think those are all ways that we found some success. Hopefully they would be successful for a junior council person. But life's most urgent question, in the words of Martin Luther King, is what are you doing for others? And if we can't solve these issues now, like when will they ever get solved? So it's better to start doing what we can, even if it's just incremental change. It doesn't have to be wholesale elimination or investment in housing elimination and parking requirements, that is, but we have to decide what our priorities are. In Dallas, we say Dallas is big enough for everyone. We're putting people over cars, and we hope that'll lead to a brighter, more affordable future.
That's great. Very inspiring. I feel very inspired already, and I've got my mind wanting to try this and think about that, and it's great. I've really appreciated the conversation. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to add? Anything else just in conclusion?
I think one final thing is like going back to the vision. If your city has a vision plan for its environmental use, for its multimodal forms of transportation, we just have to continue to remind our local government what they've committed to, who they're committed to, and hold them accountable. Don't be afraid. It takes a lot of courage to speak up in those public meetings at times, but it does get easier with practice, and it's even easier in coalition. So I hope everybody goes out there and makes the best use of these lessons today.
Yeah, that's great advice. So our council here wants to be the most accessible council in Australia. So I always make sure I include that in every letter and every email. And I just go, yes, but you have a commitment to be the most accessible local government in Australia. So what are you doing to that? You've got to hold them to account. This is what you said. So it's fantastic. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and knowledge from Texas. So it's been great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with y'all. Appreciate it.
That's Streets and People. Thanks for listening. You can find more at getaroundcaboolture.au.